Thank you both for joining me. So, Doug, let's start with the proponents of the stimulus argument, because the critique of the stimulus argument is that it's being paid for by, quote-unquote, printing money, that if you start to stimulate without paying for the stimulus in some way, what you're really doing is circulating too much money that eventually either becomes inflationary or it becomes a credibility crisis for the global economy in terms of whether they believe in the dollar or not. So if you do believe in stimulus, where's the point you can go at? Otherwise, why don't you just turn every American into a billionaire, print enough money, make everybody rich, and the economy grows? So
I should run for office on that platform. But you need stimulus because there's been a collapse in private demand, and there's been a collapse in private investment and in private consumption. The job market is in very terrible shape, and the idea is that the government, federal government, has to step in. Oh, actually, I should say the state and local government's in terrible shape too. So there's a collapse of there's that sector too. So the only sector really that has the power or the capacity to generate any kind of spending is the federal government at this point. I don't think you can borrow forever. I'm not advocating an endless deficit forever. I think we need several years of it, and then after a while, presumably the economy will begin to heal, and then you start paying down the debt by two methods in particular. I think we need to cut back in military spending rather drastically. We're spending 6 or 7% of GDP. We could easily cut that back to 1 or 2 over time. And I think also taxing rich people. The rich have gained, well, it depends upon how you want to define the rich, but the top 1% of the population has seen maybe half the benefits of economic growth over the last couple of decades. The bottom 90% has seen essentially nothing. The richest 13,000 households in this country have seen their incomes go up about 400% over the last couple of decades. Everyone else average about 10% or less. That kind of lopsidedness is not economically sustainable, it's not ethically justifiable, and that's got to come to an end. So there's plenty of money at the top end of society that could be used to pay down that debt over time. They will scream about how this will result in all sorts of horrible consequences, but they've had a pretty free run of it for the last 2 or 3 decades, and things have not turned out very well, so I think we don't have to listen to their screams.
Peter, let me read back a quote from you as an interview you gave in the Gold Report in 2009. You wrote this: we need less government, we need sound monetary policy, we need higher interest rates, we need to allow businesses to fail, we need to allow companies to go out of business or bankrupt, we need to allow foreclosures to take place, we need to allow people to lose certain jobs. We can't try to interfere with that, and to the extent we do interfere, we're going to create this depression. And if we keep printing money, we're going to have massive inflation on top of it. What I don't hear in this pain, because in other interviews you've talked about we're going to have to take the short-term pain, is any pain for the people who Doug says got so wealthy during the last period. There's no talk about taxing wealthy people, and all of this talk leads to, one would think, at least in the short term, even more unemployment.
Well, first of all, I mean, wealthy people, I mean, are paying a lot of taxes. I mean, you can consider that I'm wealthy, and I'm paying almost 50% of my income in taxes right now. That's without higher taxes. So, I mean, that's a lot of taxes. I mean, historically, I mean, that's a lot of taxes. There are some people that got rich off of financial, transactions that were in part made possible by government interference, by the Fed giving out cheap money. So I think a lot of people on Wall Street got rich based on what the government was doing, and I had a big problem with that.
Would you be okay with taxing that back?
Well, look, I think that the government shouldn't have bailed out all these Wall Street firms. We should have let them fail. A lot of the money that was earned on Wall Street in the last few years wouldn't have been earned had the government allowed some of these banks to fail.
So would you be okay with taxing that back? The money that these, like the bonuses that were received based on money that came from the government. Would
you're
you tax
asking
it
if two wrongs make a right. They shouldn't have made that money in the first place. So that's what I believe. But I don't think we need higher taxes on wealthy people. I mean, we need less government. I mean, you're talking about the fact that private sector demand has collapsed. It's collapsed for a reason. The government can't bring it back by magic. That demand was artificial. It was there because the Fed had interest rates too low. It was there because people were able to treat their homes like an ATM machine. People were buying things they couldn't afford with money that we were borrowing from China or from Japan. We can't try to recreate that phony economy.
So, Doug, isn't that true?
I'm not interested in recreating that phony economy, but you have to remember who created it. It was people like Reagan and Bush who created that phony economy. We've been hearing this mantra about getting government out and cutting taxes on rich people model for 3 decades now, and I think we have to declare this experiment a failure. And we're always going to hear about how it wasn't really tried, and there were just too many imperfections in the way this theory was applied to reality. But in fact, this has been dominated political discourse, this kind of thinking has dominated discourse and policy for 3 decades now, and we are now living in the wreckage of that, and it's really time to move on to a new model. And I think it's interesting that the Obama administration, despite all its talk about fundamental change, has pretty much signed on to that model. We've seen just recently that Obama doesn't even want to put a moratorium on foreclosures, even though the paperwork is all screwed up. Well, this is bad policy and bad politics, and it's just a slavish devotion to the dominant ideology.
Doesn't the Bush years more or less represent what you were talking about?
No.
There was certainly less regulation.
No, it represents the opposite. I mean, I agree with you on one thing, that Obama is repeating the mistakes of Bush, but the mistakes are big government and central banking. I mean, the reason that I was one of the few people that accurately forecast the collapse of the real estate market, the worst recession since the Great Depression, double-digit unemployment, the bankruptcy of Freddie and Fannie, the collapse of many of the investment banks, is because I understood how the Federal Reserve and Congress were inflating this bubble, how their interference in the free market, whether it was with Freddie and Fannie guaranteeing mortgages and creating the moral hazards, or the government guarantees of bank accounts, or the cheap money by the Federal Reserve, none of this was a free market function. It was all the result of central government